advocate, an educator, just an all-around superstar. So please join me in welcoming David Johnson to the stage.
We're supposed to have a fireside chat. I think they want us to sit on the edge of the stage. But I just want to say a couple of things before we get into that. Y'all are amazing.
Yes.
Tap that one. Yeah, listen. Caesar, wake up. Because Caesar in particular, there's one more. Y'all stand up. You two, you and Caesar stand up real quick. Because y'all was holding it down in the sea and seeing women who were doing their thing. So I want y'all to love on these little brothers right here real quick. All of the students, you stand up too. All of the students in the room stand up.
Yes.
All of y'all stand up. Because y'all are why we're here. Y'all can do better than that. Know that y'all are beautiful, y'all are brilliant, y'all are special. We expect y'all to not only go to college, but to graduate from college. Right? We expect you to take care of yourselves and each other, right? Because this is about community and village and making sure that we all get through. And when you need help, we want you to ask for it. Can you do that?
Yes.
All right, all my teachers in the room, my brothers stand up. Teachers, educators of any kind, stand up, yes. Y'all do better than that. So this is why what's going on, sir. I gotta say sit down. How often do teachers get acknowledged for doing God's work? So y'all know why we're here. And I know, especially at this point in time, look, I've been coming on the stage a lot. I'm a student here now. My brother said he wanted to go get a PhD program. You should not be paying for it. Let's talk about that. Right? Know that this is also a place with a whole lot of trauma. I'm the only black man in my department. My research is about how schools themselves are sources of trauma for black kids, especially those with intersectional identities, right? But we need to be in these spaces. Especially now that the U.S. Secretary of Education, who knows nothing about education, has the ability to control how it is that we move through spaces. We not only have to be resilient in doing our job, but communicating to other people why they need to be engaged. So not only supporting us, I heard my brother Tariq earlier saying that a part of what he needs to love the profession is to be affirmed. Right? Years ago, we had debates about people don't value educators. We definitely don't even acknowledge the work that educators do now. So it is our job to tell other people why they need to go vote. Not just because historically our ancestors died for that right, but because there are consequences that affect our babies when people stay home. So I'm saying thank you for continuing to do this work because I know that it is incredibly difficult. And I'm begging y'all to take care of yourselves in this process as well. Yes. Can you do that? Yes. Before all of y'all sit down, I just want to acknowledge this is my guardian angel. She's the reason why I can come in this space. Yolanda Celia Ruiz, rated by me. She, for so many students, not just students of color, queer students, women, white students, is what education needs in this space. She is what love looks like in practice.
That's right.
That's right. If you ever need to be recharged or restored, find her work, come sit in her class, channel her, because she does this stuff with so much grace. I just want to say thank you for all that you do. All right, y'all sit down. The last thing, can you pull? Okay, here we go. So this is the last thing I want to do. Y'all take out your phones for this because I want you to share it. You'll have technology, I want you to share it. Increase the number of people in this space. So some people know that when the world was better, I worked for still my president, Barack Hussein Obama. I led an initiative focused on educational excellence for African Americans, right? It was my job to go around the country and do this. I miss that tremendously. I now lead an organization called the National Black Justice Coalition. We're the only civil rights organization that loves on black people but acknowledges that there are some of us who have intersectional identities, right? So as long as there have been black people, there have been black LGBTQIA+ people. My brother Tariq used the term, he said cis-het. I don't know that everybody knows what that means. Cisgender means that you have the privilege of identifying with the birth, that you were the gender that you were assigned at birth, right? So we all know the gender is socially constructed, male, female. You're not just born that way. A doctor actually has to assign you that. And there are some people for whom they're not assigned either of those, right? And there are some people for whom the assignment is different than how they see themselves, right? So L, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer. Some people use intersex, some people use asexual. Y'all Google those. I'm a black man who understands that gay is a white political identifier, so I use the term same gender loving. It centers the fact that I'm black first and always. Y'all see me in that way. And if I decide to invite you into who I love, then we can have that conversation. But know that I don't need your approval. I'm not asking for it. And I'm saying this because you have to appreciate that our babies show up with intersectional identities too. For some of us, appreciate that, but hold it. For some of us, this is about updating language and vocabulary, just like I went through what LGBTQIA is. For others of us, it's about challenging the assumptions we have about people and how they should show up in the world. And here's why this matters. This is my brother, Nigel Shelby. He is our brother. He's your brother too. Nigel Shelby is a 14-year-old boy. How many people in this room are 14 or teach ninth graders? A couple of y'all. Who lives in Huntsville, Alabama, where he not only had to deal with the sting and the stigma of being black, but also being thought to be gay. And now we can have a whole nother symposium at some other point in time about the perverseness of our fascination with sexual identity, gender orientation, and gender expression, that we push this stuff on kids when they are really just beginning to figure out who they are in the world. But because educators, principals, teachers, superintendents, policymakers, cafeteria workers, because adults failed to create classroom and school environments where this young boy was seen, was valued as a whole, perfect being, and was acknowledged as a member of that community, he died by suicide. The reality is that it's not the first time that it's happened. It's not the first time that it's happened this year. The rates of mental health, trauma, it has come up in this conversation. It was nice for me to hear black men talk about love and even name trauma. But the suicide rates amongst black and Latino children have been increasing over the last couple of decades, and we haven't even talked about it. We had academic institutions, you gotta use the language of the people to dismantle their tools. There's data that shows that there's more trauma in schools now since y'all's president took office. We shouldn't be surprised by any of this. And so we should expect that when we don't acknowledge intersectional identities, that there are people with pulpits that use them to divide us, to talk about difference as a deficit, rather than acknowledging that everybody in this room is uniquely imperfect in some unique way. The consequence of this is that our babies don't feel loved. Think about it. All throughout the country, we are debating where our kids can go to bathrooms. If people can be protected in social services. This administration is denying people the ability to sign up to voluntarily go into the armed services to protect our country. We have policies that make it so that kids can't enroll in a new school if they have unpaid fines or fees. Parents fleeing domestic violence can't return a damn library book and a kid can't now go to school. These are problems that adults make. And then we look at kids and say, what's wrong with you, rather than just simply saying what's wrong. So my point here, I'm not talking to the babies because they got this. Kids in high school now, more than 80% of them identify as anything other than strictly heterosexual. Now to be clear, there's no gay agenda. People say silly things like that all the time. If there is, I want a copy of it. The point I'm trying to make here is that young people are smart enough to know that the categories that we have constructed to constrain them don't fit. They're creating terms that say male, female don't work for me. Call me Z, Zim, and there. The gender binaries just don't fit. The problem are the adults who don't want to, again, update our language and change our practices. who act as if we don't say the word homosexual, we're not going to have queer kids in front of us. That if we don't deal with our own trauma, we don't perpetuate it onto the babies that are forced to move through the spaces that we move through. So I'm sitting in this space because Nigel did not have to die. He should be here now. His mama shouldn't have to be reconciling what it's going to look like to exist in a world without her only baby. In part because she did the work to love on him. Nigel is fabulous. He would have loved y'all. Even in his darkest moments, he was writing letters affirming the beauty in his female friends. It's what happened when that baby went out into the world where he got messed up. And so I'm asking all of y'all to leverage your privilege. When somebody, a student or an adult, says something disparaging about one of our babies, you need to check them and disrupt it.
That's right.
When you are, it's about to be Father's Day, all of these holidays, don't allow yourself to sit in space where people have to erase who they are. Otherwise, shrink or apologize for how God made them. And in particular, if your classroom and school environments are not spaces where all of our babies can see themselves and be safe, engaged, and supported, then you need to consider whether or not you need to choose another profession.
That's right.
Our babies don't have a choice. We compel them, otherwise force them to go to school. And often they got to deal with our stuff. So I'm asking y'all, because we're having a conversation with the congregation, because y'all are here, to not only do this work, but to make sure that you check your colleagues are doing it too. You don't do it for any of the babies, do it for Nigel. That's all I got.
Wow. How do we have a conversation after that? Now, for people that don't know, here you go, there's some water for you. If they don't know what you've done, explain to them briefly what you've done. If you listen to the Breakfast Club, we've had them up here, 2-3 times? And the one thing about the Breakfast Club, I know a lot of you guys, if you listen to radio used to be a lot of fun and prank calls and, hokey pokey, dancy, but we've changed the landscape of that because that's what's needed. It took a while to be able to do it, but it seems like people are starting to understand what we're trying to do. So explain to people what you've done for the Obama situation, Obama administration, and what you do now, because you do so much for the community.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I get to be unapologetically me. I get to be disruptive. When I was your age, people used to say I talk a lot. If they were nice, they'd say I was loquacious and asked a lot of questions. Now I get paid to run my mouth, baby, so you keep doing that. I mean it, right? So I spent, I'm an educator. Anybody who knows me knows I tweet often using Teach the Babies. This is not happenstance. I went to Columbia as an undergraduate student. I'm from Inglewood, California. And I had the privilege of understanding the 3 things that people have said before. 1, that systems work exactly as designed. Public education works exactly as designed, as the chancellor and others have said. 2, that it is our responsibility as people of color to disrupt the reality that 98% of the workforce is comprised of white women. Right? There was this interesting thing where when I graduated from Columbia and I said I was going to go into teaching because I taught kindergarten and 3rd grade down the street. Shout out to the kindergarten and elementary school teachers. Yes. All of my classmates looked at me like I was crazy. Literally, my boys, they called themselves having an intervention. Right? Like, how do you, a first generation college graduate, you go to Columbia, like, why are you teaching? And I couldn't understand why everybody didn't want to teach, right? That this is the place where we can be disruptive, that we can leverage all of our learning, that we can support babies in changing the spaces that we still struggle to move through. And I've had the privilege of doing that. So I taught elementary school. I was a graduate student here in a master's program, and everybody was talking about policy and why we needed to understand policy, and No Child Left Behind was supposed to solve all of our problems. I said, it can't be that hard. I'll go to DC, I'll fix all these policies myself, and I spent damn near 20 years trying to do that. And then President Obama got elected, and he created an initiative that was focused on educational excellence for youth, right? And I was appointed and literally had the pleasure of running around the country to remind people that all of you are perfect, that none of you asked to be born, and that it is our responsibility to make sure that you thrive. Our country is still dealing with the vestiges of transatlantic enslavement, white supremacy, anti-blackness. So there's a person that currently has the election certificate in the Oval Office, which meant that I could not continue in that job. And so there was an opportunity for me to take on the position that I now have. And so this happened because in June, maybe 3-4 years ago, we produced the White House Summit on African American Educational Excellence, but around LGBTQ youth. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, in part because often when people talk about black people, they assume that we're all heterosexual. And then when they talk about LGBTQ people, they assume they're all white, and forget, as Audre Lorde said a long time ago, that there are lots of us that have intersectional identities, right? There are women here that might have disabilities. There are people here for whom English is not your first language, right? But we often show up in spaces where we're reduced to one thing. And the summit happened, and there were 100 beautiful, brilliant babies that came and had this amazing experience. And then we woke up to the massacre, which was post-nightclub. And it was a reminder that too often we don't have spaces like this, right? Where people can come and feel connected and vulnerable enough to share in the way that people have and to show up and show out in the way that these babies have. And so I now have a job where I get to do that, where I get to remind people that unless and until all of us are free, none of us is free. That we have to have really uncomfortable conversations about things that we don't want to talk about, like HIV, which we have on air. And otherwise, try and shift people to think more critically about the assumptions that we make. For example, why it is that we still ask kids to line up boys on one side, girls on the other, when there are more complicated, sophisticated ways of us asking them to divide themselves. We can also acknowledge that there are babies that don't fit neatly into either of those categories.
Now let's talk about education. You said you were a teacher, 3rd grade and kindergarten. How can we teach these students so they want to learn more? You know, we've talked to a couple of principals before that called on air that they use music and they change the lyrics in music so kids can remember certain math problems or languages and things like that. What do you suggest?
My suggestion is to ask them. There's this interesting thing that happens somewhere along our maturation where we forget what it's like to be experts, right? Like these babies know about their experience more than anybody else. But adults often, when seeking to do things for kids, we gather in rooms with other adults. We try and remember what it was like when we were their age. And then we design solutions that actually fit our needs, but we lie to ourselves and say that it's for them. Right. And so the way this shows up is that like you have white female teachers who don't know hip hop trying to like sing rap songs because they think that that's how babies are gonna remember things. And often they just laughing at them, right? And so I say this for 2 reasons. One, it is really important to speak the language of our babies. Yeah. Chris Emden is a phenomenal professor here at Teachers College. He wrote a book for white folks at Teach the Hood and all of the rest of y'all. And Chris speaks hip hop authentically. That's a part of his DNA. And for me, the power is not in trying to get all teachers to speak hip hop, but it is to understand that we have to speak kid. Yeah. We have to be vulnerable enough to appreciate that, like, to be an educator is not to know everything. Actually, if you think you know everything, you're lying to yourself first, right? The Latin root of the word education is educare. It means to draw out. So much of this is about affirming that they already know most of what they need to know. Everything you ever need to know, you learned in kindergarten, period. Right? Everything else is about leveling up and thinking about developing competencies and empathy and figuring out how they're going to move through the world as they identify their purpose. So this is a long way of saying just ask them and be willing to trust them when they speak. Some of this is also, right, like we want them to talk as if they are defending their dissertation at Columbia. When the work is really for us to do the work of appreciating how they speak, why they're speaking in that way, and sometimes that's referencing popular culture and music, but it doesn't always have to look like that.
Now you also talk about curriculum and what they learn. Do you think the curriculum should be changed, should be adjusted, and in how so?
Yeah, absolutely. Our curriculum is built on white supremacy and anti-blackness.
That's right.
And period. Right? And so the first thing is to acknowledge that we need to have more honest and authentic conversations about where we are. I'm looking at Yolanda Silly-Ruiz's shirt. Right? I'm also even thinking about the fact that we're having this conversation in Pride Month, which is actually just an extension of Black History Month. Yeah. Why? Because we would not be talking about Pride. There would not be an LGBTQ movement if it were not for a Black trans woman named Marsha P. Johnson. White people are all around this country, especially in a week or two, they'll be in New York for New York World Pride, and it'll be mostly white people. who get paid to be gay, who are going to take up space because a black trans woman who was in a mob-run establishment where black people weren't respected, let alone black trans women, but she needed to be there because she had to work, got tired of being harassed by the police, and said, no, not on tonight, we're going to resist. They call it a riot, she resisted. That's what led to the modern day LGBTQ movement. That's what allowed us to now get to a point where people can walk in the streets, some people, not a lot of black people, can walk in the streets and proclaim pride. I said not all because in the last 6 weeks there have been 5 black trans women that have been murdered. Yes. Because every year there are at least 30 of them and most of us don't even know their names.
That's right.
Right? And so just by telling the truth, the whole truth, we can begin to shift. Here's something that always vexes me, and I know that this might get to y'all too. How is it that we expect kids to take us seriously when we celebrate Christopher Columbus and everybody know he ain't discovered shit? Like literally, what does that mean? Like, and not only right, like that there are systems that say like this is an actual day. We're supposed to do something in acknowledgement of this, and so there are forms of resistance, right? There are educators that like teach on that day, and it's Indigenous Peoples History Day. But by exposing the lies and telling more of the truth, we can begin to shift. The other thing for me that's really important is that we are still very much in this siloed way of thinking that knowledge is contained in these nice, neat little buckets, and it doesn't work like that, right? And so allowing teachers and educators the flexibility to think when we talk cross-curriculum or, allowing us to do more so that they can have project-based learning would be another way to shift. They tired.
You talk about project-based learning. Explain that a little more.
Yeah, so this essentially, like, what we have to appreciate is that, like, we have to be mindful of how it is that people receive knowledge. This kind of a setting works best for adults. It's why some of these babies are struggling to stay awake. It just is, right? And so project-based learning acknowledges that not all people, in particular children, white privileged children who are trained to sit and to track and to receive information that they can then unpack later doesn't work for all kids. And so for us, it's about shifting and giving them projects, things that are practical, things that answer the question that usually comes up, which is why do I need to learn this? And allows them to develop skills, whether they be empathy, communication, and then what we otherwise call hard skills that they can use not only in school but in life.
Now, in closing, for the teachers there, how would you encourage them to continue on with a lot of the problems that they face? We talked about it earlier, underpaid, don't have the supplies. A lot of them dealing with students that have no help at home, Parents are not helping with homework, maybe they don't have the time, maybe the parents are not there, maybe they're going through hard times, maybe they don't have parents that are around, maybe their parents are on drugs, maybe their parents are just not there. What encouragement would you give them, since you've been there, what encouragement can you give to them?
I want to say 2 things. All of what you just described, they are true for lots of educators, but they're not the reasons why our jobs are difficult. Nobody goes in education thinking that you're going to be paid what we're not going to be paid. In particular, this is right, like to the point of telling the truth. For black men that get a post-secondary degree, teaching is the #1 profession. Right? So in a world where people still think that we're about money and being selfish, that hasn't been true for quite some time. Right? So we know that parents are not supported by the system, right? It's often not that parents are abdicating their responsibility, but they are trusting that we're going to do our job. They are also not invited into schools at times where it's convenient. Right. So I'm saying this because I want us to trouble how it is that we think about the challenges that urban educators in particular experience with black kids. The biggest challenge for me, what I've had in my own experience and what research affirms, is what Tariq said, us not feeling valued and affirmed, and us also not feeling like all of our efforts are yielding something more meaningful. Right. I left my classroom because it was vexing to feel like I would spend all this energy trying to make this one kindergarten classroom a safe space, but then my babies were gonna go someplace else the next year. So the move to DC was literally one driven of, if I can find a way to fix the whole system, I won't have to worry about, I need to catch that baby, I need to catch that baby, I need to go here, right? Too often it becomes, if they just have one good teacher, no, if all of our babies have one good system, this stuff will change. So to the educators in this room, I see you.
Thank you.
I value you. I need you to know that you are not crazy. And that you have to continue to do this work for our babies.
Yep.
Educators, we do God's work. I say it often, I believe it. I say this often, I didn't choose to become an educator. Not only did it chose me after a whole lot of resistance. Right? It's like, no, I don't want to do that. People say silly things like teaching isn't rocket science. They're right, it's a lot harder.
Yes.
I can make a lot more money being a lot less stressed. But again, because our babies are perfect, each of them, and not a single one of them asked to be born, we got to do this.
That's right.
And so whatever you need to do, playing spades and talking crap, binging on ratchet reality TV shows, right? Whatever you need to do, pour into you so that you can be whole enough to hold space for our babies until they can hold it for themselves.
Thank you.
Give it up for David John one time. I appreciate you guys for